My younger brother stranded my 7-year-old child alone in public to get back at me after our mother left me her house in the will instead of splitting it with him. He volunteered to watch my son at the mall food court while I ran to grab medicine from the pharmacy. But when I came back 15 minutes later, my son was alone at the table holding a note that said, "Now you know how it feels to lose something." I'm Marin, 34 years old, and that moment, standing frozen in the middle of the food court while shoppers flowed around me like water around a stone, marked the exact second I stopped being my brother's protector and became his worst nightmare. Leo sat there, his small hands gripping that cruel note, his SpongeBob backpack still on his shoulders like he'd been waiting for me to come save him. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry, and when he looked up at me, he didn't cry. He just said, "Uncle Declan said you'd understand the message." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A woman at the next table stared. My phone had 17 missed calls from unknown numbers. Declan had blocked me before abandoning my child. My hands shook as I pulled Leo into my arms, feeling the rapid thump of his heartbeat against my chest, smelling the artificial cherry of his shampoo mixed with the grease from the food court. He was clutching a half-eaten pretzel that had gone cold. The security guard who'd been circling our table, a kind-faced man who'd clearly been keeping watch, approached cautiously. "Ma'am, your son's been here alone about 20 minutes. A couple folks reported it. We were just about to call CPS." I thanked him, my voice steady despite the rage building behind my sternum like a pressure cooker. While he walked away, I noticed something else. Declan had left the receipt from his credit card purchase on the table. Orange Julius. Time-stamped at exactly 2:47 p.m., the moment he'd bought himself a drink before walking out on a 7-year-old. I folded that receipt and slipped it into my pocket with hands that didn't shake, didn't tremble, didn't betray the cold calculation already forming in my mind. What my brother didn't know, what nobody knew except my mother's estate attorney, was that I hadn't just inherited the house. 3 days before abandoning my son, Declan had sent me a text. "Mom always loved you more. Hope that house keeps you warm at night since you don't have anyone else." He thought leaving Leo alone was poetic justice for taking his inheritance. He thought this made us even. He had no idea I'd already documented 2 years of his increasingly unhinged behavior, saved every threatening message, recorded every voicemail where he'd promised to make me pay. My mother hadn't split the house between us because Declan had been stealing from her for the last 3 years of her life, forging checks, maxing out her credit cards, taking cash from her purse when he thought she wouldn't notice. I'd discovered all of it going through her financial records after the funeral. The attorney and I had discussed filing charges, but I'd hesitated. Family, I thought. Blood. That hesitation died the moment I read that note in my son's hands. Growing up, I'd been Declan's defender. 5 years older, I'd protected him from bullies, helped him with homework, covered for him when he snuck out in high school. Our father had left when Declan was 6, and our mother worked double shifts as a nurse to keep us fed. I'd been the one who made sure he ate breakfast, who walked him to the bus stop, who attended his parent-teacher conferences when our mother couldn't get time off. When he'd gotten suspended for fighting, I'd convinced the principal to let him return. When he'd wrecked Mom's car at 17, I'd helped him fix it before she found out. When he'd dropped out of college after 1 semester, I'd been the one who listened to his grand plans for starting a business, encouraged his dreams, loaned him money he never repaid. Our mother's diagnosis had changed everything. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, maybe 6 months if we were lucky. She'd lasted 8, and during that time, I'd moved back home to care for her. Declan had visited maybe twice a month, always with his hand out, always with some emergency that required cash. "Just until my next paycheck," he'd say, "just to cover rent. Just this once." I'd watched our mother's face each time, seen the disappointment she tried to hide, the way her fingers would tighten on the bedsheet when he'd leave without asking how she felt, whether she needed anything, if she was in pain. He'd show up for the holidays, take photos with her to post on social media with captions about family forever and cherishing every moment, then disappear again until he needed something. The house itself wasn't much, a 3-bedroom ranch in a decent school district, worth maybe $300,000. Our mother had bought it 20 years ago and paid off the mortgage through decades of night shifts and careful saving. It should have been mine and Declan's to share. It would have been if he hadn't shown his true colors during her final months. I'd found the forged checks by accident, going through her checkbook to pay her medical bills. $12,000 over 6 months, made out to cash, signed in handwriting that almost looked like hers but not quite. The signature wobbled where hers never had, the loops too wide, the pressure too heavy. I'd confronted him at her bedside. He'd denied everything, called me jealous, accused me of trying to turn our dying mother against him. Our mother had been awake for that argument. Too weak to speak much, she'd listened with tears running down her temples into her gray hair. The next day, she'd asked me to call her attorney. 2 weeks later, the will was changed. Everything to me. The house, her savings account with its modest $40,000, her car, her jewelry. To Declan, she left a letter. I'd read it after she died, found it in her nightstand addressed in her shaking handwriting. To my son who forgot who taught him to write his own name. Inside, a single sentence. You know what you did. Declan had contested the will immediately. 3 months of legal fees, depositions, investigations into whether our mother had been of sound mind when she'd made the changes. The attorney had records of her mental competency evaluation. The court had thrown out Declan's challenge. He'd called me 97 times that day, left voicemails that escalated from pleading to threatening. This isn't over. You'll regret this. You stole everything from me. I'd saved every single one. Leo had been 5 when his grandmother died, old enough to remember her reading to him before bed, making him chocolate chip pancakes on Sundays, calling him her little astronaut because he loved anything about space. He didn't remember the fights over money, the accusations, the ugliness. He just knew Uncle Declan used to bring him candy and play video games with him, and now Uncle Declan sent his mom scary messages and made her cry in the kitchen when she thought Leo was asleep. Children notice more than we think they do. The pharmacy trip had been for Leo's allergy medicine. Spring allergies hit him hard, left him miserable with itchy eyes and a runny nose. Declan had called that morning, his voice different from the usual anger. Softer, apologetic. Hey, I know things have been rough between us. I've been thinking a lot about what Mom would want. She'd want us to be family, right? For Leo's sake, if nothing else. I'd been wary, but hopeful. Maybe grief had finally broken through his resentment. Maybe he'd actually grown up. I'm at the mall, he'd continued, running some errands. If you want to grab a coffee, talk things out. I know you've got Leo today. He can hang with me while you do whatever you need. Like old times. When I'd trusted him. When I'd believed in the brother I'd raised almost as much as our mother had. I'd met him at the food court, watched him ruffle Leo's hair and ask about school, about his favorite video games, about whether he still wanted to be an astronaut when he grew up. Leo had lit up the way kids do when adults pay attention. Declan had bought him a pretzel, a lemonade, promised to watch the new space documentary with him on YouTube. You go do what you need, he'd told me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Take your time. We'll be right here. I'd been gone exactly 15 minutes. 14 to walk to the pharmacy, pick up the prescription, pay, and walk back. 1 minute standing in the food court entrance, scanning the tables, seeing Leo alone, seeing that note, understanding with perfect clarity that my brother had just used my child as a weapon. The rage that filled me then wasn't hot. It was ice cold, surgical, precise. I'd spent 2 years protecting Declan from the consequences of stealing from our dying mother because I'd clung to the fantasy that he could change, that he could be redeemed, that our mother's love could somehow transform him into the brother I remembered from childhood. That fantasy died in the same moment my trust in him had. As I held Leo, feeling him finally start to shake with delayed shock, I made a decision. Declan wanted to know how it felt to lose something. I'd teach him a masterclass in loss he'd never forget. And unlike him, I wouldn't be using an innocent child as my weapon. I'd be using something far more devastating. The truth, the law, and his own documented criminality. I pulled back from Leo, wiped his face with a napkin, and gave him the smile I'd perfected when his father had walked out on us 3 years ago. The smile that said everything would be okay even when it wasn't. You did so good waiting for me, buddy, so brave. Let's get you home. He nodded, clutching his backpack. As we walked through the mall toward the parking garage, I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls. First, to the attorney who'd handled my mother's estate. Second, to the detective who'd originally wanted to investigate the forged checks. Third, to a locksmith, because Declan still had keys to the house our mother had left me, and I'd been too soft-hearted to change the locks. That softness ended today. The attorney, Josephine, answered on the second ring. I'd worked with her extensively during the probate process, and she'd made it clear from the start that she'd wanted to pursue criminal charges against Declan for the forged checks. I'd been the one who'd held back, clinging to some outdated notion that family meant protection, even when that family member was actively destroying you. That hesitation evaporated the moment my brother had weaponized my child. I need to reopen the discussion about pressing charges, I said, buckling Leo into his car seat. He was quiet, staring out the window, processing what had happened in whatever way 7-year-olds process abandonment by someone they'd trusted. The forged checks, the credit card fraud, all of it. I want him prosecuted. Josephine didn't ask what had changed my mind. She'd seen enough family warfare to recognize the shift in my tone from reluctant victim to determined prosecutor. The statute of limitations hasn't run out. The checks alone are felony forgery. The credit cards push it into identity theft territory. Combined, we're looking at potentially 5 to 8 years if convicted. Are you certain? Once we file, there's no walking this back. I'm certain. My voice was steady. Leo's hand found mine over the center console, his small fingers wrapping around my thumb. I'll be in your office Monday morning with every piece of documentation I have. Bank statements, the checks themselves, credit card records, everything. The second call went to Detective Warren, who'd interviewed me 6 months ago when I'd first discovered the theft. He'd been frustrated when I'd declined to press charges, had told me in no uncertain terms that Declan would escalate. People who steal from dying parents don't suddenly develop a conscience, ma'am. They get bolder. He'd been right. Detective Warren, this is Marin calling about the Declan case. I'm ready to move forward. I explained what had happened at the mall, my voice clinical, detached. I'd learned during my mother's illness that emotion could wait, action couldn't. I have the note he left with my 7-year-old, his credit card receipt showing the exact time he purchased something for himself before abandoning my child, and security footage should show the timeline. I want to add child endangerment to the forgery charges. Warren's response was immediate and grimly satisfied. I'll pull the mall footage tonight. That receipt is gold, proves premeditation. He didn't just walk away in a moment of anger, he bought himself a drink first. That's calculated. Combined with the documented pattern of escalating threats and the financial crimes, we can paint a picture of someone with complete disregard for consequences. I'll need your son's statement. The thought of putting Leo through that made my stomach clench, but I'd already crossed the Rubicon. He can talk to you with me present. Monday work? Monday works. And ma'am? You're doing the right thing. Men like your brother don't stop until someone makes them stop. The locksmith met me at the house within an hour. While he worked on replacing every lock, I sat with Leo in the kitchen and made him his favorite dinner, mac and cheese with hot dogs cut into little octopi, the way my mother used to make it. He picked at his food, unusually quiet. Mommy, why did Uncle Declan leave me? His voice was small, confused. Not hurt yet. That would come later, in nightmares and trust issues, and the long shadow childhood abandonment casts. Right now, he just wanted to understand. I chose my words carefully, crouching down to his eye level. Uncle Declan made a very bad choice because he was angry at me. But that's not your fault, and it's not okay. What he did was wrong, and there are going to be consequences for it. Like timeout? Like grown-up timeout, yes. I smoothed his hair back from his forehead. You know how Grandma used to say that actions have consequences? Uncle Declan is going to learn about consequences. After Leo went to bed, I opened my laptop and began the methodical process of building my case. My mother had been meticulous with record keeping, a habit from decades of nursing, where documentation meant everything. I had 7 years of bank statements, every credit card bill, every check register. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Starting 3 years before her death, monthly withdrawals of exactly $500, labeled medical expenses. Except I'd been the one managing her medical care, and I'd never received that money. I pulled the corresponding check images from the bank's online archive, all signed with that slightly off version of her signature. But there was more. Going deeper into her email account, the password she'd shared with me during her final months, I found correspondence with a financial advisor I'd never heard of. Someone Declan had apparently convinced our mother to consult about estate planning. The advisor, a man named Preston, had recommended our mother open a separate account for tax purposes. That account, I discovered through careful searching, had been slowly drained over 18 months. Another $23,000, transferred in small increments to an account in Declan's name. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I knew immediately who it was. Declan had a pattern of creating new numbers when I blocked the old ones. "You're really going to do this? Drag your own brother through the mud because Mom left you everything? You've always been jealous that she and I were closer. That's what this is really about." I stared at that message for a long moment, at the sheer audacity of it, the reality-bending narcissism required to abandon a child and then claim moral high ground. My fingers moved across the keyboard with clinical precision. "You abandoned my 7-year-old son to prove a point about a house. You're going to prison, Declan. I'm going to make absolutely certain of it." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "You're bluffing. You don't have the spine. You never have. Why do you think Mom always liked me better? Because you're weak." That message, I realized with cold satisfaction, would look excellent in court. Screenshot, save, add to the growing file. I blocked the number and created a new folder on my laptop. Declan, criminal evidence. Every text, every voicemail, every threatening email went into that folder. By midnight, I had a 60-page document chronicling 2 years of harassment, financial fraud, and culminating in child endangerment. Sunday morning brought an unexpected call from Declan's landlord, a woman named Blair who'd been a friend of our mother's. "Marin, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I need to talk about Declan's rent situation. He's 3 months behind, and he used your mother as a reference when he signed the lease. Said she'd be co-signing. Do you know anything about this?" I closed my eyes. Of course he had. "Blair, my mother died 8 months ago. She couldn't have co-signed anything." The silence on the other end was heavy. He showed me documents, her signature. This was 4 months ago. 4 months ago. 4 months after our mother's death. He'd forged her signature on a lease agreement, used a dead woman to secure housing. My hands were remarkably steady as I asked Blair to email me copies of everything. "I'm already in the process of pressing charges for forgery. This adds another count." "There's more," Blair said hesitantly. "He's been subletting the second bedroom without permission, against the lease terms. The guy he's renting to has been dealing drugs out of the apartment. We've had complaints from neighbors, and I've got evidence. I was about to evict both of them, but if there's a criminal case..." "Don't evict yet," I said, my mind racing ahead to the implications. "Let me talk to the detective handling the case. This could be valuable evidence of a pattern of illegal activity." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with my second cup of coffee, watching Leo build an elaborate Lego spaceship at the dining table. He was humming to himself, resilient in the way children are, already bouncing back while I cataloged the full extent of my brother's depravity. The drugs were new information, but they fit the pattern. Declan had always taken the path of least resistance, always chosen shortcuts over hard work, always believed the rules didn't apply to him. My phone rang again. Josephine calling on a Sunday, which meant she'd been doing her own digging. "Marin, I made some calls yesterday, checked with some contacts in financial crimes. Your brother's name came up in an unrelated investigation. There's a task force looking into a mortgage fraud scheme. Apparently someone's been using deceased individuals' information to open fraudulent accounts and credit lines. 3 of the victims are in our county. Your mother's name appears on a credit card application that was submitted 6 months after her death." The coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. "What? Capital One, $15,000 limit? Applied for online using her social security number, birth date, and an address that's actually a UPS store. The card was used extensively for 3 months before the company flagged it as suspicious. The address on file? The UPS store is 2 blocks from Declan's apartment." I set the cup down carefully. Can you connect me with whoever's running that investigation? Already did. Special Agent Ivy from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division wants to talk to you. She's very interested in what you've documented about the earlier forgeries. Said if this is part of a larger pattern, it could tie into their case. Marin, this isn't just state charges anymore, this is federal. Federal charges. Years in federal prison, not state. No possibility of early parole. My brother had, in his greed and arrogance, committed crimes that would destroy his life completely and irreversibly, and I was going to help law enforcement document every single one. Set up the meeting, I said. I'll bring everything. Leo looked up from his Legos. Mommy, can we go to the park today? It's sunny. Absolutely, buddy. I smiled at him, genuinely this time. Let me just make one more phone call first. That call was to my mother's former financial advisor, a woman named Camille, who'd handled her actual retirement accounts, not the fraudulent one Declan had set up. I explained what I'd discovered, asked if she'd be willing to testify about my mother's mental competency, and the fact that she'd never have approved separate accounts she didn't know about. Your mother was sharp as a tack until the very end, Camille said firmly. She knew every penny she had and where it was going. She was especially careful after your father cleaned out their joint account when he left. There's no way she authorized any separate accounts without telling you, especially during those last few years when you were managing her care. I'll testify to that in a heartbeat. Your brother is a thief, and he used your mother's illness as an opportunity. That's unforgivable. By Sunday evening, I had testimonies lined up from the estate attorney, the financial advisor, the landlord, and Detective Warren. The FBI agent wanted to meet Tuesday. The credit card company had agreed to provide all transaction records. And Declan, believing I was bluffing, had sent me 6 more threatening texts from yet another new number, each one more evidence for the prosecution. I put Leo to bed, read him 3 chapters of his current favorite book about astronauts, and kissed his forehead. He was already half asleep, clutching the stuffed rocket my mother had given him for his 5th birthday. Love you, Mommy, he mumbled. Love you too, little astronaut. In my own bedroom, I opened my laptop one more time and began drafting a detailed timeline of every crime I could document. Forged checks, credit card fraud, identity theft, lease fraud, child endangerment. Each one color-coded, cross-referenced with dates and evidence. I worked until 2 a.m, until my eyes burned and my shoulders ached, until I had a document so thorough that even the most overworked prosecutor couldn't ignore it. Declan had taught me how it felt to lose something when he'd stolen from our dying mother. Then he'd compounded that lesson by abandoning my child. Now I was going to teach him about loss in a way that would define the rest of his life. Not through abandonment or theft or cruelty to children, but through the inexorable machinery of justice he'd set in motion himself through his own actions. Every forged signature, every fraudulent account, every threatening text had built the prison cell he was about to occupy. I was just holding the door open and making sure it locked behind him. Monday morning arrived with the sharp clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since before my mother's diagnosis. I dropped Leo at school, watching carefully as he ran toward his classroom, checking for any lingering trauma from Saturday's abandonment. His teacher, a warm woman named Sienna, caught my eye and gave me a questioning look. I'd emailed her Sunday night with a carefully worded explanation that Leo had experienced a family incident and might need extra patience this week. She walked over while Leo hung up his backpack. Everything okay? He seems a little quieter than usual. His uncle left him alone at the mall this weekend as some kind of twisted revenge tactic. He's processing. I kept my voice low. Factual. I'm meeting with police today about it. Sienna's expression hardened. Jesus, I'll keep an extra eye on him. And Marin, whatever you're doing about it, don't hold back. People who use kids as weapons don't deserve mercy. The validation from someone outside my immediate circle strengthened my resolve. This wasn't about vengeance or pettiness. This was about protecting my child and ensuring Declan couldn't hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt our family. Josephine's office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse downtown, all exposed brick and modern furniture that managed to feel both professional and welcoming. She had everything laid out on her conference table when I arrived. Copies of the forged checks, bank statements, the police reports I'd filed 6 months ago, the timeline of threats and harassment. Before we dive in, she said, pouring us both coffee, I want you to understand what you're initiating. Criminal charges against a family member, especially your only sibling, will have social consequences. People will judge you. They'll say you should have forgiven him, worked it out privately, given him another chance. Are you prepared for that? I set down my bag and met her eyes. He left my 7-year-old child alone in a public place to punish me for refusing to let him steal my inheritance the way he stole from our dying mother. I'm not prepared for judgment. I'm counting on it. When people ask why I did this, I'll tell them exactly what he did. Let them judge that. Josephine's smile was sharp and approving. Good. Because the DA's office is very interested in this case. I spoke with the prosecutor this morning. They see it as a slam dunk, documented pattern of financial crimes, clear evidence, sympathetic victim in your mother. The child endangerment charge elevates it from property crime to something that's going to get media attention. Will that be a problem? Depends on how you handle it. The prosecutor thinks it'll work in our favor. Man steals from dying mother, then abandons nephew to punish sister who inherited the house is a headline that makes prosecutors look good when they win. Which they will. We spent 3 hours going through every document, organizing them chronologically, highlighting the most damning evidence. The forged checks alone totaled $37,000. The credit card fraud added another $23,000. The post-mortem identity theft. The credit card opened in our mother's name after her death was $15,000. $75,000 stolen from a woman dying of cancer by her own son. There's something else, I said, pulling up the emails I'd found between Declan and the fake financial advisor, Preston. This advisor convinced my mother to open that separate account. I looked him up. He doesn't have any legitimate credentials, no licenses, no registrations with any financial regulatory bodies. I think he was working with Declan. Josephine leaned forward, reading the email chain. This is conspiracy to commit fraud. If we can prove they were working together, Preston faces charges too, and he might flip on Declan to reduce his own sentence. Do you have contact information for this advisor? Email and phone number, both from the correspondence with my mother. I forwarded everything to her. He told her the account was for tax-advantaged estate distribution. She was on heavy pain medication by that point, not thinking clearly. Declan brought him to the house twice, presented him as someone Mom's doctor had recommended. Her doctor recommended a financial advisor? Josephine's eyebrows rose. No, that was a lie. I called Dr. Tiago this morning. He'd never heard of Preston, never made any such recommendation. Said if Declan claimed otherwise, that's another count of fraud, medical impersonation, or something similar. The attorney made notes, her pen moving rapidly across her legal pad. We're building a RICO case here. This isn't just a wayward brother making bad choices. This is organized criminal activity targeting vulnerable people. The FBI is going to love this. My meeting with Special Agent Ivy was scheduled for 2 that afternoon, at the Federal Building downtown. Josephine offered to come with me, and I accepted gratefully. The FBI's white-collar crimes division occupied an entire floor, all glass offices and serious-faced people in suits examining computer screens filled with financial data. Agent Ivy turned out to be a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She shook my hand with a grip that communicated both sympathy and professional detachment. Mrs. Marin, thank you for coming in. I understand you have information related to our investigation into post-mortem identity theft. It's Ms., I corrected automatically. And yes, my mother died 8 months ago. My brother has been using her identity to open fraudulent accounts. Over the next 2 hours, I walked Agent Ivy through everything. The timeline of crimes, the forged checks, the fake financial advisor, the credit card opened in my mother's name after her death. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her expression growing progressively grimmer. The credit card is definitely part of our investigation, she said finally. We've been tracking a network of individuals who target recently deceased persons using obituaries and public death records to identify victims. They open credit lines, rack up charges, abandon the accounts before anyone notices. Your mother is victim number 47 in this particular ring. 47. My mother had been one victim among dozens, maybe hundreds. The scale of it made my stomach turn. You think Declan is part of an organized ring? We know he is. The IP address used to submit the credit card application in your mother's name traces back to a cafe 3 blocks from his apartment. Security footage from that cafe shows him and another man. We've identified him as Preston, the fake financial advisor, working on laptops together on the day the application was submitted. We have them on camera, Ms. Marin. We just haven't had enough evidence to make arrests until now. Agent Ivy pulled up a video on her computer. Grainy security footage showed Declan and a man I didn't recognize sitting at a cafe table, laptops open, clearly collaborating on something. The timestamp matched the date on the fraudulent credit card application. Can you use this? I asked. Combined with your documentation of the earlier financial crimes and the child endangerment charge? Absolutely. This moves from a local case to federal prosecution. Mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud. We're looking at minimum 15 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts. And given the evidence you've provided, conviction is virtually certain. 15 years minimum. Declan would be 44 when he got out, middle-aged, with a felony record that would follow him forever. No career prospects, no family support, no future beyond what he could scrape together from the ruins of his own choices. The cold satisfaction that filled me wasn't pretty, but it was real. He'd stolen from our dying mother. He'd abandoned my child. This was justice. There's one more thing, Agent Ivy said. We'd like to use you as a witness in the larger case. Your testimony about Declan's methods, the fake financial advisor, the pattern of behavior, it helps establish the conspiracy. Are you willing? Whatever you need. Detective Warren called as I was leaving the federal building. The mall security footage had been preserved and reviewed. It showed Declan walking Leo to the table, buying himself an orange Julius, sitting with Leo for approximately 3 minutes, then walking away while Leo was distracted, watching something on Declan's phone. Leo sitting alone for 19 minutes before I appeared. The premeditation was crystal clear. The prosecutor wants to charge him with child endangerment, reckless conduct, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor, Warren explained. Given that he's your son's uncle, there's also a betrayal of familial trust element. Combined with everything else, Judge is going to throw the book at him. When? I asked. We're executing a warrant for his arrest tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. at his apartment. Given the federal charges, FBI will be there too. It's going to be a joint operation. You'll want to stay home with your son. This will likely make local news. I thought about Leo, about protecting him from seeing his uncle arrested on television. Will you let me know when it's done? First call I make. That evening, I sat Leo down for a serious conversation. He was building another Lego spaceship, this one modeled after the Mars rover he'd been studying in school. I settled onto the floor beside him, helping him find the right pieces while choosing my words carefully. Remember how we talked about Uncle Declan facing consequences? Leo nodded, not looking up from his construction. Grown-up time out. Right. Well, that's going to happen soon, and it might be on TV or in the newspaper. Some of your friends at school might hear about it and ask you questions. Now he looked at me, his dark eyes serious. What did Uncle Declan do? He took money from Grandma when she was very sick, and he did some other bad things to other people, not just our family. The police are going to arrest him, which means they'll take him to jail. Will he come back? The question pierced me, not, is he okay? Or, can I visit him? But, will he come back? The question of a child who'd learned that people who leave sometimes don't return. His father had taught him that lesson. Declan had reinforced it. Not for a very long time, I said honestly. And when he does, he won't be allowed to come near us. I've made sure of that. Leo thought about this, then went back to his Legos. Okay, can we have pizza for dinner? Children's resilience is both heartbreaking and miraculous. He'd already processed his uncle's abandonment and moved on to the immediacy of dinner plans. I envied him that ability to compartmentalize, to protect himself by focusing on what mattered, the safe, small world of Lego spaceships and pizza night. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about my mother, about the woman who'd worked double shifts to give us opportunities she'd never had, who'd read to us every night despite exhaustion, who'd taught me that family meant showing up, being present, caring for each other. Declan had perverted everything she'd tried to instill in us. He'd taken her lessons about family loyalty and twisted them into an excuse for entitlement. He'd watched her die and seen only an opportunity for theft. My phone buzzed at 2:17 a.m., another text from another burner number. Last chance to make this right. Drop the charges and we can forget this ever happened. I'll even apologize to Leo. Family should forgive family. I screenshotted it, added it to the evidence file, and blocked the number. Tomorrow morning, law enforcement would be knocking on his door. These desperate messages were the last gasps of someone who'd finally realized his actions had consequences. But it was far too late for apologies or negotiations. The wheels of justice were already in motion, and I'd made certain they'd roll straight over him. Detective Warren's call came at 6:47 a.m. while I was making Leo's breakfast. We've got him, arrested without incident at his apartment. FBI took custody because of the federal charges. He'll be arraigned this afternoon. I pressed the phone to my ear, spatula in my other hand, eggs sizzling on the stove. Did he say anything? Asked for a lawyer, then demanded to know if you were happy now. Seemed to think this was all your doing rather than consequences for his own crimes. Warren's tone was dry. Guys completely disconnected from reality. The FBI found his laptop still open to a spreadsheet tracking deceased individuals' information. Names, social security numbers, dates of death, over 200 people. Your mother was just one entry in a massive fraud operation. 200. The scope of it stole my breath. Declan hadn't just stolen from our mother. He'd made a business of targeting the recently deceased, their grieving families, their final assets. Every number on that spreadsheet represented someone's parent, someone's spouse, someone's loss being exploited for profit. The press is going to be all over this, Warren continued. The FBI's public information officer is planning a press conference this afternoon. Fair warning, they'll want to interview you. You're under no obligation, but it would help the case if you were willing to speak about your mother specifically. I flipped Leo's eggs, watching the whites set around golden yolks. I'll do it. The arraignment was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the federal courthouse. Josephine called with updates throughout the morning. Declan had been assigned a public defender because he had no money for a private attorney. The judge had denied bail given the flight risk and severity of charges. He'd be held in federal detention pending trial. Each piece of news was another nail in the coffin he'd built himself. The press conference happened first, at noon. Special Agent Ivy stood at a podium in the FBI's Public Affairs Office, flanked by Detective Warren and the county prosecutor. I sat off to the side with Josephine, my hands folded in my lap, projecting calm competence while cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes. Today, the FBI and local law enforcement have arrested 29-year-old Declan in connection with a massive identity theft and fraud scheme targeting deceased individuals. Agent Ivy began. The investigation has uncovered over 200 victims across 3 states, with total losses exceeding $2 million. Declan allegedly worked with accomplices to obtain death certificates and obituary information, which they then used to open fraudulent credit accounts, file false tax returns, and steal from grieving families. The details she shared were damning. The cafe security footage, the spreadsheet of victims, the testimony from financial institutions about fraudulent applications. Then she introduced me. One of the victims was the defendant's own mother, who died of cancer 8 months ago. We're joined today by her daughter, Marin, who first brought this criminal activity to our attention. I stepped to the podium, feeling the weight of cameras trained on me. I'd prepared remarks with Josephine's help, focusing on my mother's dignity, her hard work, the betrayal of her trust. But standing there, I set aside the prepared speech and spoke from the heart. My mother was a nurse for 37 years. She worked night shifts and double shifts and holidays to support my brother and me after our father left. She taught us that family meant showing up for each other, being there in hard times, doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. My voice remained steady. When she was diagnosed with terminal cancer, I moved home to care for her. During her final months, my brother systematically stole from her, forging checks, opening fraudulent accounts, exploiting her illness for personal gain. When she discovered what he'd done, she changed her will to protect what little she had left. I paused, meeting the cameras directly. After her death, my brother contested the will. When he lost, he escalated to threats and harassment. This weekend, he abandoned my 7-year-old son alone in a public place as punishment for me inheriting the house our mother left me. That's who he is. Someone who uses children as weapons, who steals from dying parents, who sees other people's grief as an opportunity for profit. The questions came rapid fire. How did I discover the theft? What was my mother's reaction? How was my son doing? I answered each one calmly, factually, painting a picture of systemic cruelty and calculated exploitation. By the time I finished, several reporters looked visibly disgusted. The story had everything: a dying mother, a greedy son, a grandmother's inheritance, an abandoned child. It would lead every local news broadcast tonight. The arraignment itself was brief and procedural. Declan was led into the courtroom in orange prison scrubs and handcuffs, his hair unwashed, his eyes scanning the gallery until they landed on me. The look he gave me was pure hatred, unfiltered and raw. I stared back without flinching, without dropping my gaze, until he looked away first. His public defender, a harried woman named Rowan who looked fresh out of law school, entered a not guilty plea. The prosecutor requested remand without bail. The judge, a stern man in his 60s, reviewed the charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, child endangerment, forgery, and agreed. Given the severity and scope of the alleged crimes, the number of victims involved, and the defendant's clear willingness to flee or harm others to avoid consequences, bail is denied. The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial. Declan erupted. "This is bullshit. My sister is lying about everything. She turned my own mother against me, and now she's trying to destroy my life." The judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "One more outburst and you'll be held in contempt. Sit down, Mr. Declan." As they led him out, he twisted in the guard's grip to shout at me, "You're going to regret this. You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll make sure everyone knows what you really are." The judge signaled the bailiffs, who physically dragged Declan from the courtroom while he screamed threats and accusations. His public defender looked mortified. The prosecutor smiled grimly and made notes, and I sat perfectly still, showing nothing. While inside, I felt the cold satisfaction of watching someone finally face the consequences they'd spent years evading. Outside the courthouse, Josephine pulled me aside. "That outburst was the best thing that could have happened. The judge will remember it. The jury will hear about it. He just showed them exactly who he is, someone with no remorse, no accountability, someone who blames everyone but himself." My phone had been blowing up during the arraignment. Text messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, former classmates and distant relatives, all wanting to share their shock and support. One message stood out, from Blair, Declan's landlord. "I just saw the news. I need to tell you something. Declan's roommate, the one dealing drugs, he's talking to police, says Declan was part of the distribution network, using his apartment as a hub. Thought you should know before it comes out publicly." Drug distribution. Of course. Why stop at fraud when you could add narcotics trafficking to your criminal resume? I forwarded the message to Agent Ivy and Detective Warren, then called Blair directly. "How long has this been going on? At least 6 months, maybe longer." The roommate, guy named Elliot, apparently approached police for a deal after the FBI raided the apartment this morning. Said he'll testify against Declan in exchange for reduced charges. He claims Declan was the connection between suppliers and street dealers, managing logistics and money laundering through various accounts. Money laundering through fraudulently obtained accounts, using stolen identities to facilitate drug trafficking. The criminal enterprise was larger and more complex than I'd imagined. Agent Ivy called 10 minutes later, confirming that Elliot was cooperating and additional charges were being prepared. "This changes the timeline," she explained. "We need to build a more comprehensive case now. Trial will probably be 6 to 9 months out instead of 3. But the drug charges carry mandatory minimum sentences. Even if he somehow beat some of the fraud charges, the drug trafficking alone puts him away for a decade minimum." "How certain are you of conviction?" 99%. "We have documentation, witnesses, surveillance footage, and a cooperating co-conspirator. The only way he walks is if he takes a plea deal. And given what we're offering, 25 years versus 50 years if he goes to trial and loses, his attorney would be malpractice not to push him to take it." That evening, the local news led with Declan's arrest. They used my press conference sound bites, showed footage of him being escorted from court in handcuffs, interviewed several victims of the identity theft scheme. One was an elderly man whose wife had died of Alzheimer's. Declan had stolen her identity and racked up $30,000 in credit card debt in her name, while her widower was still grieving. Another was a woman whose teenage son had been killed in a car accident. Declan had filed a fraudulent tax return in the dead boy's name, stealing his final tax refund. The public reaction was swift and brutal. Social media exploded with outrage. Declan's Facebook page, which he'd apparently maintained with cheerful posts about his entrepreneur lifestyle, was flooded with comments calling him everything from a monster to a sociopath. Someone had screenshotted the Instagram photos he'd posted with our mother during her illness. The carefully staged pictures of him holding her hand or bringing her flowers, all while he was actively stealing from her. The comments on those posts were vicious. Leo was in bed when the 10 o'clock news aired Declan's perp walk. I watched it alone, a glass of wine in my hand, studying my brother's face as he was led into the courthouse. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the handcuffs, his bravado stripped away to reveal the frightened, angry child beneath. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. Then I remembered that note in Leo's hand. Now you know how it feels to lose something. I remembered my mother's face when I'd shown her the forged checks, the tears running into her gray hair. I remembered every threatening voicemail, every manipulative text, every time he'd promised to change and then immediately reverted to the same destructive patterns. The pity vanished, replaced by steel-hard resolve. Declan had made his choices at every step. The choice to steal, to lie, to threaten, to abandon a child. Those choices had consequences. I was simply ensuring those consequences were proportional to the harm he'd caused. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Probably Declan using someone else's phone from jail. I almost deleted it unread, but curiosity won. The message was short. Mom would be ashamed of what you're doing to me. I stared at that text for a long time, then typed my response with deliberate care. Mom was ashamed of you long before she died. That's why she left you nothing. That's why her last words to you were, "You know what you did." She saw exactly who you are. And now the whole world does too. I hit send, blocked the number, and finished my wine. Tomorrow, the discovery process would begin in earnest. Tomorrow, Declan's public defender would receive the 1,000-page evidence file documenting his crimes. Tomorrow, the reality of 15 to 50 years in federal prison would begin to sink in. But tonight, I allowed myself the satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally being served. Not revenge. Justice. There's a difference. Revenge is petty, personal, about making yourself feel better. Justice is about restoring balance, about ensuring that those who harm others face appropriate consequences, about protecting society from predators who see other people's pain as opportunity. Declan had chosen to be a predator. I'd simply made certain he'd be held accountable for that choice. And unlike him, I had no regrets about any action I'd taken. Only satisfaction that I'd finally stopped protecting someone who'd never deserved protection in the first place. The trial began 8 months later, in February. Those intervening months had been a strange sort of peace. Leo thriving in second grade, my work life stabilizing, the house finally feeling like mine rather than my mother's legacy with Declan's shadow hanging over it. The media attention had faded after the first few weeks, replaced by newer scandals and tragedies. But the investigation had continued methodically, building an airtight case. Declan's public defender, Rowan, had tried multiple times to negotiate a plea deal. 25 years? Then 20, then 18. Each time Declan had refused, convinced somehow that he'd be acquitted, that the jury would see him as a victim of his cruel sister's vendetta rather than the architect of his own destruction. His delusion was comprehensive and unshakable. The prosecution's evidence was devastating. Day 1, they presented the forged checks, all 23 of them, each signed in that almost right version of my mother's handwriting. A forensic document examiner testified that the pressure patterns and letter formations were inconsistent with my mother's genuine signature, particularly in the tremor-affected final months of her life when her hands shook too badly to write clearly. The forged signatures showed none of that tremor. They were too perfect, too controlled. clearly done by someone with a steady hand copying her earlier signature style. Day 2 brought the credit card fraud. Representatives from 3 different card companies testified about fraudulent applications submitted using deceased individuals' information. The cafe security footage played in the courtroom. Declan and Preston hunched over laptops, clearly collaborating. Timestamps on the video matched exactly with the electronic submission times for fraudulent applications. The prosecutor walked the jury through it methodically, establishing not just that crimes had occurred, but that Declan had been the one committing them. Agent Ivy testified on day 3 about the broader identity theft scheme. 217 victims across 3 states. $2.3 million in total losses. The spreadsheet found on Declan's laptop, with its meticulous tracking of death dates, social security numbers, estimated estate values. She projected it onto the courtroom screen. Rows and rows of names, my mother's among them, each one representing a family's grief being exploited for profit. The prosecutor had organized the evidence chronologically, showing how Declan had started small with the forged checks against our mother, then escalated to credit card fraud, then connected with Preston and expanded to a multi-state operation. The pattern showed calculation and increasing audacity. This wasn't someone making a one-time mistake. This was someone who'd built a criminal enterprise and refined it over years. Day 4 was the hardest, my testimony. I'd prepared extensively with the prosecution team, knew every question they'd ask, every piece of evidence they'd have me authenticate. But sitting in that witness box, with Declan glaring at me from the defense table, his hatred palpable across the courtroom, was different from preparation. The prosecutor, a skilled woman named Harper, walked me through my mother's illness, the care I'd provided, the discovery of the forged checks. I spoke clearly, keeping my voice steady, focusing on facts rather than emotion. When she asked me to describe finding the first forged check, I pulled it from memory with clinical precision. It was September 14th, 3 months before my mother died. I was paying her medical bills and reconciling her checkbook. The check number sequence didn't match. There was a gap. Checks 1847 through 1851 were missing from the register. I called the bank and requested images of those checks. All 5 were made out to cash, signed with my mother's name, totaling $6,000. When I showed them to her, she said she'd never written them. What was your mother's reaction when you showed her the checks? I met the jury's eyes. She cried. Not just because of the money, but because she knew immediately who'd taken it. She said, he promised he'd changed. Harper showed me the checks one by one, asked me to confirm they weren't in my mother's handwriting. Then she showed me my mother's actual handwriting from the same time period, a birthday card she'd written me, her signature shaky and barely legible due to the cancer medication affecting her motor control. The contrast was stark. Then came the character testimony. Dr. Tiago, my mother's oncologist, explained her mental state during her final months. Sharp, aware, fully competent, despite pain and medication. Camille, the financial advisor, testified that my mother had been meticulous about her money, would never have approved separate accounts without telling me. Blair, the landlord, described Declan's lease fraud and the drug operation run from his apartment. The FBI's computer forensics expert explained the spreadsheet, the systematic targeting of vulnerable families. And then, most damning of all, Elliot, Declan's former roommate, took the stand. Elliot was 24, thin, with the hunted look of someone who'd made bad choices and was trying to survive the consequences. He'd taken a plea deal, 5 years for conspiracy to distribute narcotics in exchange for testimony against Declan and Preston. His testimony was devastating. Declan recruited me to help with the identity theft stuff, Elliot explained in a flat, emotionless voice. He'd get the information about dead people, names, social security numbers, and I'd help submit credit applications online. We'd get the cards sent to different addresses, then use them to buy drugs that we'd distribute through a network of dealers. The profit from drug sales got laundered through more fraudulent accounts. It was a whole ecosystem. How did Declan obtain the information about deceased individuals? The prosecutor asked. Multiple ways. Sometimes he'd scrape obituaries online. Sometimes Preston would get death certificates through contacts he had in various county offices. I think he was bribing clerks. Sometimes Declan would just use people he knew, like his mom. That was actually how the whole thing started. He told me he'd been stealing from his mom for years, and after she died, he realized he could keep using her identity because nobody had flagged it yet. That gave him the idea to expand. The jury's faces showed disgust. One woman in the front row was actively glaring at Declan. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment the jury understood that my mother hadn't been a victim of opportunity, but rather the test case for a larger criminal enterprise. Declan had used our mother's death as a business model. Cross-examination was brutal. Rowan, Declan's attorney, tried to paint Elliot as an unreliable witness, a drug dealer trying to reduce his own sentence by lying about Declan. But Elliot had documentation, text message chains, email exchanges, transaction records that corroborated every detail of his testimony. The jury looked unmoved by the defense's attempts to discredit him. On day 5, the prosecution called their final witness, me again, this time to testify about the child endangerment charge. This was the part I'd been dreading, the part that would require Leo to be mentioned explicitly, his abandonment detailed for the public record. On April 16th, did you have an interaction with your brother Declan? Harper asked. Yes. He called me that morning, said he wanted to reconcile. He was at the mall and suggested we meet for coffee to talk things out. He offered to watch my son Leo while I ran to the pharmacy to pick up allergy medicine. What happened when you arrived at the mall? Declan was in the food court with Leo. They were eating pretzels. Declan seemed friendly, engaged with Leo, asked him about school. I told them I'd be 15 minutes, just needed to grab a prescription from the pharmacy in the mall. Declan said to take my time, they'd be fine. And when you returned? This was where it got hard. I took a breath, steadied myself. Leo was alone at the table. Declan was gone. There was a note folded under Leo's pretzel basket. It said, "Now you know how it feels to lose something." The courtroom went completely silent. Harper let that silence stretch, let the jury sit with the image of a 7-year-old child abandoned in a public place by his own uncle. How long had Leo been alone? Security footage showed approximately 19 minutes. He was 7 years old in a crowded mall food court, alone, because Declan wanted to punish me. Punish you for what? For inheriting our mother's house, for pressing charges about his theft, for not letting him destroy me the way he'd destroyed her. Rowan's cross-examination tried to suggest Leo hadn't been in real danger, that the mall was safe, that Declan had known I'd return quickly. I shut that down immediately. My 7-year-old son thought his uncle had abandoned him. He sat there for 19 minutes not knowing if anyone was coming back for him. That's not safe. That's traumatic. That's using a child as a weapon. The jury looked at Declan with open contempt. Whatever sympathy they might have had for a brother caught in a family dispute evaporated when confronted with the reality of what he'd done to a child. The defense's case was weak. Character witnesses who testified that Declan had always been charming and helpful, that this must be a misunderstanding, that surely his sister was exaggerating. But none of them could refute the documentary evidence, the forged signatures, the security footage, the spreadsheet, Elliot's testimony. Rowan did her best, but she was defending the indefensible. Declan didn't testify. Rowan had probably advised against it, put him on the stand, and the prosecutor would destroy him. Better to let the evidence speak and hope for reasonable doubt. But there was no reasonable doubt. The case was airtight. Closing arguments took half a day. The prosecutor methodically reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness, every crime. The defendant didn't make a mistake. He didn't have a moment of poor judgment. He built a criminal enterprise that victimized over 200 families, stole over $2 million, and traumatized his own nephew to avoid accountability. This wasn't desperation. This was greed, calculation, and absolute moral bankruptcy. Rowan's closing was a desperate appeal to sympathy. Family dynamics are complicated. Siblings fight. Grief does strange things to people. But it rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the 4 women stood to read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Wire fraud, guilty. Mail fraud, guilty. Identity theft, guilty. Conspiracy, guilty. Child endangerment, guilty. Money laundering, guilty. Every single charge, guilty. Declan's face went white, then red, then white again. He turned to look at me one final time, and I held his gaze without flinching. This was justice. This was accountability. This was what happened when you spent years hurting people, and finally someone fought back. Sentencing was set for 3 weeks later. The mandatory minimums added up to 35 years. The prosecutor was asking for 50 years, effectively a life sentence for a 29-year-old man. Rowan filed the expected motions for leniency, character letters from people who believed Declan could be rehabilitated. But I'd submitted my own letter to the judge, detailing every crime, every threat, every harm he'd caused to our family, and dozens of others. I'd attached photographs of my mother from her final days, letters she'd written expressing her heartbreak over his betrayal, records of the money she desperately needed for medical care that he'd stolen instead. The sentencing hearing brought a packed courtroom, media, victims and their families, prosecutors, and me, sitting in the front row where Declan couldn't avoid seeing me. Judge Owen, the stern man who'd denied bail 8 months ago, reviewed the pre-sentencing report with evident distaste. Mr. Declan, you have been convicted of a systematic pattern of financial fraud, identity theft, and exploitation of vulnerable individuals, he began. You stole from your dying mother. You recruited accomplices to expand your criminal enterprise to target hundreds of families in their moment of grief. You used your nephew as a pawn to punish your sister for reporting your crimes. You have shown no remorse, no accountability, no recognition of the harm you've caused. Declan's attorney tried to interject about his difficult childhood, his father abandoning the family, the pressure he'd felt. The judge cut her off. His sister experienced the same childhood, the same absent father, the same financial hardship. She responded by caring for their dying mother, building a career, raising her son. The defendant responded by stealing, lying, and destroying lives. Childhood trauma doesn't excuse adult criminality. The victims who'd submitted impact statements were given a chance to speak. The elderly widower whose wife's identity had been stolen broke down describing how he'd discovered $30,000 in fraudulent charges while planning her funeral. The mother whose teenage son had died in a car accident described the violation of having his death exploited for profit. And I spoke last. My mother spent her final months knowing her son was stealing from her, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. She died knowing he'd prioritized money over her dignity, her comfort, her care. That knowledge broke her heart. And after her death, Declan expanded his crimes to target hundreds of other families, other dying parents, other grieving children. Then he used my 7-year-old son to punish me for standing up to him. This man doesn't deserve leniency. He deserves every year of the sentence he's earned. Judge Owen nodded slowly, then delivered his ruling. It is the judgment of this court that the defendant is sentenced to 50 years in federal prison on the fraud and identity theft charges, to run consecutively with a 10-year sentence for child endangerment, and an additional 15 years for drug trafficking and money laundering. Total sentence, 75 years, without possibility of parole for a minimum of 40 years. 75 years. Declan would be 104 years old before he could even be considered for release. Effectively, he would die in prison. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Rowan looked stunned. This was far harsher than anyone had anticipated. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the defendant is ordered to pay restitution to all identified victims in the amount of $2.3 million, plus all legal fees incurred by the prosecution. His assets, such as they are, will be seized and distributed among victims. Declan finally broke, screaming at me across the courtroom. You did this! You destroyed me! I hope you're happy! I hope you rot in hell for what you've done to me! Bailiffs moved to restrain him as he lunged toward the gallery. Judge Owen's gavel cracked repeatedly. Remove the defendant. This proceeding is concluded. As they dragged Declan out, still screaming threats and accusations, I sat perfectly still. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just felt the weight of 8 months of testimony, evidence, and justice finally lifting from my shoulders. It was over. He was finished. And I had kept my promise to protect my son and honor my mother's memory by ensuring her killer, because that's what he'd been. Killing her spirit before cancer killed her body. Faced every consequence he deserved. 3 years later, I stood in the backyard of the house my mother had left me, watching Leo, now 10 years old, launch model rockets with kids from his astronomy club. The backyard had changed significantly from my mother's time. I'd converted her flower beds into a vegetable garden that Leo helped maintain, installed a telescope platform for stargazing, and built a small workshop where we constructed rockets and science projects together. The house itself had become truly mine through years of small changes, new paint and colors I chose, furniture arranged for comfort rather than show, photographs on the walls that told our story rather than maintaining some idealized family image. My mother smiled from several frames, but they were candid shots from happy moments, not the staged photos Declan had insisted on during her illness. Leo's therapy had been remarkably successful. Dr. Quinn, his child psychologist, had helped him process the abandonment and understand that his uncle's choices had nothing to do with Leo's worth or lovability. We'd talked about it extensively. Age-appropriate conversations about what addiction to money and power could do to people, how some adults made terrible choices, how family wasn't defined by blood but by who showed up and stayed. "Mom, watch," Leo called, pointing to a rocket he'd painted to look like the Mars rover. "This one's going to go over the fence." I watched him launch it with his friends, saw the pure joy on his face, and felt grateful that Declan's attempt to hurt him had left no permanent scars. Children are resilient when they have stability and love. I'd made certain Leo had both in abundance. My career had flourished in the years since the trial. The marketing firm had promoted me to senior management, recognizing the strength it took to handle the media attention with such grace, turning personal trauma into powerful public advocacy for victims of financial exploitation. I'd become a sought-after speaker on elder abuse and identity theft, using my mother's story to push for stronger protections and harsher penalties. The house, which Declan had seen as a prize to be claimed, had become a home filled with laughter, science projects, and the kind of ordinary happiness he'd never valued because it couldn't be monetized. I'd paid off the mortgage early using money from my promotion. Every room held memories of Leo growing up here, height marks on the kitchen doorframe, artwork taped to the refrigerator, the worn spot on the living room carpet where he liked to build Lego cities. Preston, the fake financial advisor who'd partnered with Declan, had taken a plea deal and testified against other members of the identity theft ring. He'd received 20 years, already serving in a different facility than Declan. The whole network had been dismantled. 17 people total, all convicted, all serving lengthy sentences. Over 400 families had received restitution from the seized assets, though no amount of money could truly compensate for having a loved one's death exploited. I'd used my portion of the restitution, $73,000 recovered from Declan's accounts, to establish a college fund for Leo and donate to pancreatic cancer research in my mother's name. Every dollar Declan had stolen had been transformed into something productive, something that honored her memory instead of desecrating it. Declan's letters arrived occasionally, forwarded by his prison. I never opened them. Whatever self-justification or blame-shifting he'd written held no interest for me. His public defender had filed multiple appeals, all denied. His sentence was final, his future determined. In 40 years, when he was eligible for parole consideration, he'd be 69 years old. I'd be 74. Leo would be 47, likely with children of his own who'd never meet their great-uncle, the federal prisoner. Sometimes people asked if I felt guilty about the harshness of his sentence. The question always surprised me. Guilty about what? About documenting crimes he actually committed? About protecting my child? About ensuring 200 families received justice? The only guilt I felt was that I'd waited so long to act, that I'd protected him for years from consequences he'd richly deserved, that my mother had died knowing her son was stealing from her because I'd hesitated to involve law enforcement earlier. Last month, Leo's school had assigned a family history project. He'd chosen to research his grandmother, interviewing people who'd known her, gathering stories about her nursing career, her resilience, her dedication to family. For the presentation, he'd worn her old nurse's cap, carefully preserved in a memory box, and spoke about her with pride and love. He mentioned that she'd died when he was young, that she'd left behind a legacy of caring for others. He didn't mention Declan at all. To Leo, his uncle simply didn't exist anymore, had become a cautionary tale about choices and consequences rather than an actual person. And I'd made peace with that erasure. Some people earn their place in family stories. Others earn their absence from them. The astronomy club meeting wrapped up as parents arrived to collect their kids. Leo helped clean up the rocket launch equipment, chatting excitedly about the upcoming science fair, where he'd be presenting a project on Mars colonization. His enthusiasm was infectious, his confidence a stark contrast to the frightened child I'd found alone at that food court 3 years ago. After the last family left, Leo and I sat on the back porch swing my mother had installed decades ago, watching fireflies emerge in the twilight. This had been her favorite time of day, the quiet transition between activity and rest, when she'd decompress from long shifts and reconnect with us. "Mom," Leo said thoughtfully, "do you think Grandma would be proud of us?" I pulled him closer, breathing in the grass and sunshine smell of a 10-year-old who'd spent the day launching rockets. "I think she'd be incredibly proud of you, buddy. You're exactly the kind of person she hoped you'd become. Curious, kind, brave. What about you? Is she proud of you?" The question pierced me in the way only children's questions can, direct, honest, requiring real answers. I thought about my mother, about the last lucid conversation we'd had before the morphine doses increased and clarity became rare. She'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and said, "Take care of yourself and Leo. Don't let anyone hurt you. Promise me." I'd promised, and I'd kept that promise. "I think so," I said finally. "I hope so." Leo was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm glad we live here. I'm glad Grandma left you the house. It's a good house." "It is a good house," I agreed. "Full of good memories and good people." He didn't ask about Declan. 3 years of therapy and careful explanations had given him all the closure he needed on that subject. His uncle had made bad choices, faced consequences, and wasn't part of our lives anymore. Simple, clear, age-appropriate truth. As darkness settled and the fireflies multiplied, I thought about the paths that had led here. Declan's choices spiraling downward into criminality and consequence, mine moving forward into stability and purpose. We'd both been shaped by the same childhood, the same abandonment by our father, the same financial struggles. But we'd chosen different responses to that shared history. He'd chosen to take, to exploit, to justify his actions through victimhood and blame. I'd chosen to build, to protect, to break the cycle of harm rather than perpetuate it. And in the end, those choices had defined our lives more than any circumstance of birth or hardship ever could. Tomorrow I'd receive notification about my next speaking engagement, a conference on financial elder abuse in Chicago, where I'd share my mother's story with 200 professionals working in victim advocacy. Next month, Leo's science fair would consume our evenings with preparation. Next year, he'd start middle school, entering adolescence with the foundation of security I'd fought to provide him. But tonight, I sat on my mother's porch swing with my son, watching fireflies and making plans for tomorrow's rocket launch practice. This was the life Declan had tried to destroy with his note, "Now you know how it feels to lose something." What he'd never understood was that you can't lose what you've built with your own hands, protected with your own strength, and defended with unwavering resolve. I hadn't lost anything. I'd won everything that mattered. My child's happiness, my mother's house transformed into our home, the satisfaction of justice served, and the peace that comes from knowing that predators who target the vulnerable sometimes meet someone who fights back and wins. Declan was where he belonged, paying the price for crimes he'd chosen to commit. I was where I belonged, raising my son in the house my mother had protected for us, building a future she'd have been proud of. And if that made me heartless or unforgiving in some people's eyes, I could live with that judgment. I'd made my peace with prioritizing protection over forgiveness, justice over family loyalty. Some bridges deserve to be burned, some people deserve to be left behind in the ruins of their own making. And some victories are won not through forgiveness and reconciliation, but through ensuring that those who cause harm finally face every consequence they've earned. As Leo yawned and leaned against my shoulder, I thought about that note one last time. Now you know how it feels to lose something. Declan had meant my inheritance, my sense of family, my trust. But all I'd lost was my illusion of who my brother could be. And in exchange, I'd gained clarity, strength, and the absolute certainty that I'd do anything to protect what truly mattered. He'd lost 75 years of freedom, his reputation, his future, and any chance of redemption. I'd lost nothing but the burden of protecting someone who'd never deserved protection. The scales weren't just balanced, they'd tipped decisively in favor of justice. And I'd sleep perfectly well tonight, as I had every night since the verdict, knowing that every action I'd taken had been right, necessary, and proportional to the harm he'd caused. Some people call that revenge. I called it accountability. And I'd never regret a single moment of it.